A new year is here, and if we want to make progress in our worship ministry and get better at what we do, then we need a plan. So, in this video, let's come up with a plan together for you and your worship ministry so that you can know what you need to focus on this year in order to develop your worship team. Here's how I like to think about developing worship teams. I like to, first of all, I need like a system. I need a structure for everything. I can't just come with a blank piece of paper and then magically something pops into my mind and I write it down. So, what do? We put some framework around it. We put a skeleton around it. So here's the skeleton that I like to use for worship team development in my worship ministry. And it revolves around thinking around these three areas. There is the musical side of worship team development, there is the spiritual side of worship team development, and there is the relational side to worship team development. So we've got three potential buckets that we can pour into in our worship ministry. We can focus on the musical side of leading worship, we can focus on the spiritual side of leading worship, or even the spiritual side of our individual worship team members, and then we can also focus on the relational side. So let's talk about what those three areas might look like, and you can focus on all of them this year, or maybe you find it best to just focus on one or two of those this year. Let's talk about the musical side first, because I think that this is the most obvious, and this is what we think of when we think of developing our band. It's probably like one of the first things that comes to mind is we want to be better musicians at the end of this year than we were at the beginning of the year. And so we have to think about what that looks like, and that can take many different forms. And I'm not going to give you like specific things you need to focus on this year in your ministry because I don't know your ministry, but if I give you the principles, the concepts, then I think that you can figure it out for your specific ministry because you're the leader of your specific ministry after all. So when it comes to the musical side of things, what does your team need to focus on? What does your team not do as good as they should be doing, or maybe they're doing okay at it right now when it comes to the musical side of things, but they could do better? I think of a few things that could potentially help a worship team. I see it on my Real Talk episodes. I always get questions about how people aren't playing together in their worship team, so you might have 5 musicians or however many musicians on your team, and they are all just playing their own individual parts. The keyboard player's over there playing their pre-written sheet music or something maybe, and then you have the drummer over there who doesn't like to play slow songs, so they like double time every song or something crazy like that, and then you have the bass player who's not playing with the drummer even though that's the rhythm section and they're supposed to be playing together. You could even talk about vocalists at this point, and if you've got 3 vocalists who aren't blending together, then that's not going to sound very good either if everybody thinks that they're singing the lead part even though they're singing harmony and they're just not blending together like they should be. So if you want your band to play together, first of all, we need to recognize that problem and identify it. And this is just the first step, and then we'll take steps to fix it. But the first step is to identify it. So, is it that your team doesn't play well together? Or maybe for you, your team plays well together, but you have always wanted to implement click tracks into your team so that they can be even tighter in their playing together, because now they're all playing to click and it's not just this arbitrary tempo that somebody sets at the beginning of the song. Maybe that's your musical goal for this year. That doesn't fall into the spiritual bucket and it doesn't fall into the relational bucket. That is the musical goal. So pick a musical goal if you think that your team is struggling musically. Some of your teams are like great at music. And maybe for this season, you don't need to focus as much on that because you need to focus on the spiritual and relational side of things. Although I do recommend probably having at least one goal from each of these buckets that you can move towards. That way you're getting a holistic development of your worship ministry. So what is it? Playing together with your team, implementing click tracks. Maybe your harmony isn't the best on your team and you need to really focus in on harmony, singing this year. Or maybe for your team, it's raising up new worship leaders, or maybe just vocalists in general, and you don't have anybody else who can lead a song vocally, or you don't have very many people who can lead a song vocally, and you need to work with some vocalists this year to raise them up, improve their singing, help them get more confident in singing in front of people, leading people in worship, and that could be your musical goal for this year. Now let's talk about the spiritual bucket, the spiritual development of your team. And I think that this kind of takes maybe two forms. There's like the personal spiritual development of your team, but there's also the collective spiritual development of your team. For instance, you could say, like, from the personal side of things, I want everybody on my worship team to feel comfortable leading prayer during our rehearsals. That would be, I think, a great tangible, attainable, measurable goal for your worship team. At the end of this year, through the steps that we take to develop people, to help them be more confident in leading prayer, and it can just be during your rehearsal for now. I mean, hopefully it overflows into your service time so that you aren't the only one who's praying all the time during your worship services. But you can say, at the end of this year, I want to be able to call on anybody in my worship team at the end of our rehearsals and say, hey, could you close us in prayer? And they would be ready to go. And that is like a personal thing. It's sort of something we're all striving towards as a team, but it really relies on the person. So that's like a personal spiritual goal per person on your team. Another one of those could be like, I want everybody on my team to develop a personal devotional time with God outside of our normal devotionals that we might do at worship rehearsal. And maybe your team struggles with that. Like, they are kind of just musicians in your church, and they do a really good job musically, but you know that they probably aren't spending time in the Bible, praying, whatever it is. And so we need to identify that so that we can work towards it. So those are the personal spiritual goals, but there's also sort of the collective spiritual goals that I think of. And a lot of this revolves around theology and what I want to teach my team spiritually about leading worship, probably specifically, although it could be about anything. But specifically, since they're in the worship ministry, I want to teach them spiritual, theological concepts about worship that will shape our understanding of what corporate worship is. And so maybe at the end of this year, you want them to be able to define what the purpose of corporate worship is. What are we doing when we gather together? Because that's going to lead to answering the question, how do we accomplish that goal? Or maybe you get the sense that they're just singing songs and the words are just coming out of their mouths and we're not really thinking about what we're singing. And so maybe for you, it's getting my team to understand the specific lines that we're singing in these songs, and we're going to take the lyrics and look at them before we introduce a new song. Or if we aren't introducing a new song, we're going to take a song that we've led for a while that might be repetitious and it's just like this routine song that we sing, and we're actually going to sit down and break down the lyrics and understand what it's saying so that we can lead our church in singing it better. That is a spiritual development because we're looking at the theology of the songs that we're leading. Or it could be something as simple as defining what is a worship leader for your team and helping them understand the role. So there are two kinds of spiritual developments. There are personal spiritual developments and team spiritual developments. And then I said there's one more bucket, and that is the relational bucket. This is like how your team functions together. Are they just a group of musicians who show up on Sunday morning and run through a couple songs and then play those songs together, but they don't have any deeper connection than that? Do you want your team to have a deeper connection? Do you want your team to be more like a small group where people have deep connections with each other, where they can have honest conversations with each other, things that don't even have to do with worship ministry, but just about life in general? And admittedly, the relational bucket, I think, is a little bit harder to measure because it's like, how do you measure a deep relationship or not? But like one of the things that I would think of is I want the people on my team to be able to have deep, meaningful conversations about more than surface level things. And once again, I know that that's not really measurable, but I think you know what it looks like whenever you see it. So that could be a relational goal, or maybe you don't see your worship team as like this small group environment, but you want people to be a part of small groups, and you have small groups in your church. And so your goal at the end of the year is to get everybody on your worship team to participate in a small group in your church. That would be driving the relationship, not just of your team, but actually the relationship of your worship team with your entire church. All in all, there are three buckets. There is the musical side of things that we should be focusing on, there's the spiritual side of things that we should be focusing on, and there is the relational side of things that we can focus on. So maybe take a moment to think about those three areas and think, First of all, what is the biggest problem on my worship team right now that I would like to fix this year? That's usually the best way to actually develop, is to identify problems and then fix them. And so pick one problem from each of those buckets. What's the biggest musical, maybe it's not a problem, maybe that's not the right word, maybe it's just a musical thing that you need to develop in your team, something that you could do better musically with your team. Then move on to the spiritual side. What's something spiritually with my team, either personal on a person-to-person basis or as my team as a whole, maybe theology or some understanding of worship that you feel like they don't quite understand yet. What can I teach them this year about that? And then relationally, what problems do I have on my team relationally? And maybe you don't have any problems on your team relationally. And that goes to say that you don't need to focus equally on all of these three buckets. I think that we can develop each of these three areas, but at the end of the day, there's going to be seasons where we need to focus more on, I think we should always be focusing on the spiritual side of things, but there might be seasons where we need to focus more on the musical side than the relational side, or maybe there's going to be seasons where we have great musicians on our team and they don't get along very well together, or they just don't have deep relationships with each other, and so we need to focus on the relational side. So try to come up with something for those three buckets, at least two of them, so that we can move on to the next step. Because once we identify what we want to develop, what specific goal we are trying to develop musically, spiritually, or relationally, or all three, then we can ask the question, how am I going to accomplish that goal? What specific steps am I going to take to allow my team at the end of this year to reach that goal? And so, once again, I think examples serve best here. So let's talk through those three areas again with some examples. Number one, let's talk about the musical side of things. If you want to implement tracks in your worship ministry this year, let's talk about what a system for that would look like. How are we going to accomplish that? Well, first of all, you might not even use in-ears in your worship ministry right now. And so I think the first step before we even play with click tracks is getting our team used to playing with in-ears, just in general, to hear ourselves through in-ears. That's such a difference, I think, for people to move from floor monitors to in-ears. It sounds different, and I think at the end of the day, your team will see that it's better than just having a floor monitor, as long as you set it up correctly and you have ambient mics so that people can hear the room and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I think they will see that it is better, but it's going to take them some time. And so instead of just throwing everything at them at once and being like, we're going to have in-ears and we're going to play to a metronome and we're going to have tracks and so on and so forth, we got to do it progressively. So I would start with, like, for a month, just at rehearsals, we're going to use in-ears. Not even on Sunday mornings necessarily yet, but just for a month at rehearsals, we're going to get used to them. It's going to be weird at first, but over the course of a month, and you can play it by ear, maybe you need a little bit longer than that, but after that time, we're going to move from just using it in rehearsals to starting to use it on Sunday morning. So now we're progressively taking steps where we start just at rehearsal with in-ears, and then we implement it into our services. And now, once people are used to in-ears, that serves as the vehicle to get click tracks and other tracks into our ears. And now that we have in-ears and people are starting to get used to that, once again, I'm just giving arbitrary time frames here. It might be different for your team, but let's say after 2 months, your team is used to in-ears. Now we can add something else. We can start putting click tracks in their in-ears and just do that at rehearsal for a month. And maybe it's not even for every song. Maybe you start with one song and get people used to playing that song with click tracks, and then slowly add more and more and more. And then by the time you get to, the fourth or fifth song, people will probably be like, okay, I can do this for every song that we do now. And you do that for a month. And you do it at rehearsals, and then you implement it into your service. And now your team is playing with click tracks, well, first of all, with in-ears, and with click tracks, so that now your team is playing the same tempo. Do you see how we took the final goal of, I want to implement click tracks into my worship ministry? We took that final goal, broke it down into steps that allowed us to actually achieve it. So that could be a musical goal. We could do the same thing with spiritual goals. Maybe you picked a specific theological understanding or topic or something that you want to teach your team about worship. You picked that specific thing. How do we achieve that specific thing? Well, we could find a book on it and have our team read a book together for like one chapter a week. And after 8 to 10 weeks, 2 months, 2.5 months, our team would have a much better understanding of that theological topic than if they didn't read that book at all. Or maybe for your ministry, you've never even focused on the spiritual side of things at all, and it's always been pretty much just the musical side of things, and you need to implement a devotional time into your rehearsals. You could do that too. You could say, okay, this isn't even really a progressive thing. I think it's just starting in this new year, I want to be more intentional about focusing on the spiritual side of leading worship. And so at the beginning of our rehearsal or the end of the rehearsal, wherever it is, we're going to have 15 minutes where we have a devotional before or after our rehearsals. Or if you want to go all out, you could schedule like a worship team workshop and get together on some Saturday morning and focus on one specific thing. And really, this works for any of the 3 buckets. You could definitely do this musically, but spiritually as well. Get together on a Saturday morning for 2.5 hours, something like that, and teach your team some specific theological concept that they need to understand on a deeper level. I did this with my worship team and my tech team when I first started at this church, and the theological concept was, surprise, we are all worship leaders. And I included my tech team in this too, because as we got together, we realized, or I wanted them to realize, you aren't just here to play music, you aren't just here to run slides or run sound, but our act is facilitating the worship gathering. And so that is completely different than just, I need to click the arrow to get to the next slide in ProPresenter. And now instead of that, the slide operators know it's not just about me clicking an arrow to get to the next lyrics. It is about me putting the lyrics up on screen in the appropriate amount of time so that the people of my church can respond and worship together, and we can teach and admonish one another. And then just real quick, if you want to focus on the relational side of things, what could we do? We want our team to have deeper relationships. And so what do we need to do? We need to get together outside of our worship rehearsals so that people have time to not just focus on the musical side of things, but we can actually build relationships with each other. So I'm going to have a team night, a get-together, a dinner or a game night or something where my worship team can just come together. They don't have to worry about preparing for Sunday. We're just going to get together to have a good time and to build fellowship with one another. So now we've got the goals for each of those 3 buckets: musical, spiritual, relational. We've got what we're trying to accomplish this year. We've got how we are going to accomplish that. And I just want to ask you, now, what can you commit to on a regular basis, semi-regular maybe, that will help you achieve those goals? And we kind of already covered that, and these are the steps that I can take to achieve this. But I think especially when it comes to the spiritual side of things, it's not just a one-time thing. It's not just I'm going to do this thing one time and then boom, we're done. Spiritual development is an ongoing process. So we need to implement rhythms and routines into our worship ministry that allow us to constantly be developing spiritually. And so here are some examples that you might want to implement this year. First of all, you might want to implement a 15-minute devotional during your rehearsal every time you meet. I think that that's a great place to start for the spiritual side of things and the relational side of things too, as your team has a chance to talk and not just get together and play music. So maybe that's what you want to implement. From here on out, for this entire year, I'm going to commit to a 15-minute devotional time with my worship team. And I just know now every time that I show up for a rehearsal, I'm going to have a 15-minute devotional ready for them where we study the Bible, or maybe we're going through a book or something like that, or maybe I find a worship team devotional that I can use with my team every single week. Another specific thing that you could commit to is just scheduling in advance 4 team nights for this year. Look at your calendar, probably 1 a quarter, plan them in advance and say, these nights, our worship team is going to get together and do something. I don't know what it is yet, but we're going to get together for dinner maybe. We're going to get together for a game night. Maybe we're going to go on a hike together. Maybe we're going to go to a concert together, whatever it is. But at least once a quarter, because I want to deepen my worship team's relationships, and those relationships are deepened not just in the rehearsal time themselves, but outside of the rehearsal time where people can have conversations about deeper things, I'm going to commit to making those happen. One a quarter, 4 times a year. And then if you want like a big burst of improvement, the biggest bursts of improvement that I have seen have really come from having specific intentional worship team workshops where we get together and we focus around one specific topic. So maybe for you, that's 2 times this year. You want to schedule a worship team workshop where you get together with your team on a Saturday morning and focus on something that relates to one of your specific goals that you have for your worship ministry this year, for your worship team. And I know that that can be a lot of work, which is why this week I just released a worship team workshop called Worship Leading Foundations. I've done all the work for you for one of these worship team workshops. All you have to do pretty much is show up with your team, watch a few of the sessions that I've already put together, and talk about the sessions with the provided discussion questions. And in that workshop, your team is going to learn what worship is, what corporate worship is, what the goal of corporate worship is, and ultimately how to accomplish that goal every single week. This is why I'm calling it Worship Leading Foundations, because it is really the foundation of everything that your worship team needs to know to get them pointed in the right direction so that they understand their role of what they're trying to do on Sunday so that they can actually accomplish what God has called them to accomplish. So if you're interested in that, check out the Worship Team Workshop, Worship Leading Foundations. I'll link it down in the description below. It's launching for the first time this year, this week. So if you get it this week, I'm going to throw in for free a copy of my 8-week worship team devotional called We Are All Worship Leaders, which kind of supplements and reinforces the ideas of that workshop. So it's not, at the end of the day, just a one-time get-together, although that's where it starts, but then you get 8 weeks after that with your worship team focusing even more on the specific concepts that were taught in the workshop about what worship is, what the goal of corporate worship is, and how we accomplish that goal every single week. So if you're interested in checking that workshop out and having that maybe be the catalyst for developing your worship team this year, check that out. I'll link it down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Till I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.